Okay, I'm back with your second video on Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior, looking more specifically at the second half of the book and what is to come of the characters of the novel memoir as they're more entrenched into the American cultural landscape. In this part of the novel memoir, you see some stories about the narrator's aunt, her mother's sister, coming to the United States. You see some stories about the young version of the Kingston narrator and her learning what it means to talk. And this is a continuation of the talk story element that we learned about in the first half of the video. Learning to talk and tell story and put the past into a new version of itself. Finding her own voice was a very large part of this. And then lastly, in the last section of the memoir, we get one more version of talk story in the sort of mythologized, updated translation of the Sai Yen poetess, a captured woman warrior who must live and survive by telling stories of the golden age of Chinese history. This is represented in that last section, the 18 stanzas for a barbarian reed pipe, sometimes called in Chinese culture 18 songs of a nomad flute. It's all about the Han dynasty from many, many centuries ago. And the stories are meant to be a survival mechanism, as this Sai Yen poet is among barbarians. She's off in a land unknown to her and afraid, and she's being put in danger. And she survives by telling these stories, by updating them, and by bringing them as her weapons, as her words of action and armor, much the same way that the woman warrior motif that Kingston started at the beginning of this novel memoir was played out to be a version of telling stories of women and of Chinese past and updating them in order to survive the present day scenario. So really what this second half, the falling half of this novel memoir is about is getting to this idea of the nature of tradition being changed. And in the last video I mentioned a lot about this sort of transgenerational, transcultural, and in literal terms a transoceanic familial culture identity in the Chinese immigrant from this time. What we have in this second half of the book is a nod to the way that this newly impinged upon identity combines that traditional with an updated version, and it sort of questions the notion of authenticity, right? Is tradition, in quotes, ancestry, etc., is that all sort of true? Is it valid? Is it authentic? Or is change, evolution, development, growth, adaptation, is that more a reflection of authenticity? And that's a question that I think we can ask of just about any immigration story as you assimilate and as you adapt and as you deal with many, many different power exchanges. You know, are you, in deviating from a traditional past, are you challenging a sort of objective authenticity of identity? And that's one of the reasons why, among a handful of others, why we might look at this work in a postmodern sense, a postmodern class. I've taught this before, in fact, and that very nature of challenging an authenticity, a supposed truth, really, really speaks to that particular element of story. You might also say that there is no center. Why? Because there's a highlight of not ethnocentricity, but instead the highlight is focused on ethnic difference. A merge or a hybrid, a combination It's the opposite of ethnocentricity, where there is no center to the system. Instead, it's decentered. The environment that the late versions of the narrator and the narrator's mother grow up into in the United States is very decentered, and the American landscape, in fact, is meant to be seen as a decentered point of view. And in postmodern criticism, we can definitely see its relation to taking away that sort of touchstone of authentic reality. And so, in looking at the way that Kingston positions America or the United States or the West here as a sort of golden mountain motif, what the novel / memoir also brings into play is that gold mountain as being sort of unfulfilled. Unfulfilled expectations are, of course, a large part of the postmodern aesthetic as well, right? Promises that are sort of diffused and perhaps ignored or misadapted or forgotten, etc. All of that unfulfillment is being sort of tossed about in Kingston's narrative, and instead, those promises are in need of being controlled by the narrator herself, and she learns this through the many different elements of how controlling the story of these characters becomes a position of power. One example of this is, of course, in one of the larger stories from this second half of the book is the story of Brave Orchid and Moon Orchid coming to the West to claim her rights as first wife. And the story between the two sisters and the dichotomy that exists between them is played out for us in a way that shows Brave Orchid's, whether it's a westernized sense of personal identity versus Moon Orchid's very self-effacing and I don't know what you want to call it. It's a lacking in terms of that sense of a right or a power privilege that ultimately, when Brave Orchid tries to urge her to claim her right, and Brave Orchid, in fact, steps in and does this for her, or tries to do this for her, it ultimately leaves Moon Orchid wasting away and being forgotten and sort of diminished by the time that we last hear of her. And if you remember, the last bit that we hear of Moon Orchid is that she's descended into a madness. She's, in fact, the entropic force to Brave Orchid's actions towards reuniting or reconnecting things in a way that works against entropy. And so Moon Orchid's descent into madness is meant to be part of a binary with Brave Orchid's, we might call it immigrant success or immigrant zest that Pfeiffer speaks of in her book. Moon Orchid is the opposite. Some of the other things that you'll see in this second half of the book that I would like you to question and perhaps even consider writing about in your reading response is the way that the West in general is portrayed, right? It's portrayed largely through Kingston's own generation, looking back, looking at her mother, at her aunt, at the immigrants themselves, and what they mean to the Chinese American experience. So it's developed by that particular, I don't want to say bias so much as that perspective, the idea of the firstborn American. And in fact, this makes me think there's a well-known graphic novel memoir about this, and it's actually called ABC, or American Born Chinese, which looks at this very element. And I'll put a link up to this text that you can find if you're interested to check it out. It reads very fast. I'll put a link up to it on our Blackboard site. But it's about this very thing, right? And when we look at immigration patterns, just in general, let's talk in general, there are certain elements of generational disconnect that are almost innate. And it usually begins with that separation between the immigrant generation and their offspring in the new country. And that is Kingston's subject matter here. She definitely wants to play on that separation, that disconnect that happens. And then the next generation after that is a little bit more disconnected, etc. But the major focus of her disconnect is that immediate one on that generation that actually did the traveling, and then the first generation that was born here. Further, she takes it to the realm of gender and looks at how this is played out in the women in her culture, right? And what makes this even more interesting than just looking at gender in general is looking at the sort of cultural restraints that Chinese culture has imbued in her family and in her mother in particular. Last time in the video prior, I talked about Brave Orchid's previous history in China and her sort of roguish female identity, and that's sort of transported to America, where she becomes this iconoclastic figure of Chinese American woman who must recognize in her daughter an element of strength that she also seems to kind of stoke by giving her that very first story, the no-name woman story, telling her the story that she's not supposed to tell, recognizing, by implication, that there is some sort of matrilineal, transgenerational information that needs to be passed on. And now Kingston, or the narrator's version of transforming that information into a modern-day story, taking those things right from the very beginning and putting them into her own sort of media, right? Whether that be not talk stories so much as written, creative, just projecting one's narrative into the universe is largely what the Kingston narrator is meant to do. And it's this is of course a stand-in for Kingston herself. And what is Kingston if not first and foremost a writer, a teller of stories? So the Kingston narrator in this book must also dig into that power for her own sort of weaponry, the telling of stories, the chronicling of pasts, etc. So how is the West depicted in that storytelling is one way that you might get into this. Another question you might ask, and I sort of hit on this already, is Moon Orchid's fate, her sort of degradation into madness and failing to reclaim her right and establish herself in the United States, is that a representation of cultures failing to merge, or something else? Is it a little bit of a twist on an immigration story of being submerged, right? Being sort of unsuccessful. We sense that there are many stories, metaphorically, like Moon Orchids, the fact of not creating that space or that identity where success in the true in quotes, true American sense is possible. And does Moon Orchid's failure to latch on to a cultural success story, does that nod to Kingston noting the way that this happens for many, many women, many, many people in general who immigrate and are dismissed by certain elements, or don't actively engage full on, right? There are cultural traits that don't translate here, it seems to be saying, the elements of first and second wife that other cultures might have, in this case, that's a particular scenario. They don't translate here, and so therefore it creates a lot of chaos, a lot of destructive force that if you're not adaptable, if you're not, powerful enough, can take you down and create a failure in a larger sense. Is Moon Orchid meant to represent those things? I think that there's certainly something to that idea. I'm not entirely sure if that's all that Kingston has Moon Orchid serving as. Other places you might look for something to write about, the very basic representations of China versus representations of the U.S. Kingston's got a very, very poetic and mystical style to her writing. Does she merge these ideas of orality, of telling stories as a purpose for creating history, and telling stories as a purpose for simply creating and entertaining or teaching? Does she merge those well, and in so doing, does she represent China and the U.S. a little bit differently? Do they overlap at all? It's something that might be more a question of style and structure than content, but I think that the two of them are related. And the medium becomes part of the message of what it means to be a Chinese immigrant at this time. It's something that you could pour into a little bit more. And, that element, the very basic element of story or narrative, is probably the way to begin to get into this. And then lastly, as I mentioned, I've taught this novel, memoir, whatever it is that we want to label it, in a postmodern fiction course. And you might ask, if you know a little bit about the aesthetic of what makes postmodern literature or postmodern art postmodern, there are certain elements here that you could certainly hone in on. Certainly the idea that there are multiple versions of the same event, so perspective and sort of point of view matter here, and subjectivity versus objectivity is definitely highlighted. There's also the idea that oral and written narratives have a large distinction between them and create a symbiotic but also sometimes very jarring relationship. They might correct one another, negate one another, work with one another in a way that creates a narrative that's alive versus fixed and dead. Okay, and that certainly is reproduced again and again, just in fact in the very opening of the story. Don't tell the story that I'm telling you now. Okay, well, right away you're creating a contrasting binary between not telling the story and telling the story. Well, you can't tell them not to tell the story without telling them the story. Okay, and that exists right from the beginning. Other elements of postmodernity. Silence as an act of performance, holding on to story, is in fact part of telling story as well. Creating our own myths. This is something that from the get-go we talk about the myth of Mulan, and we end with the story of Sai Yan, the poet warrior. This is some of what Kingston is doing in the middle, is taking these traditional myths, mixing them up with some American story and mythology, and producing or working towards constructing a new myth, more or less, an idea of mythologizing the current identity of Chinese American immigrants. Okay, this is something that's taking something old and using it in a new fashion for sort of a a disruptive purpose. And lastly, I'll just throw out a couple more elements. Nostalgia is certainly something that can be addressed in a postmodern sense. You're looking at things with rose-colored glasses, then you're certainly moving away from authenticity. Post-colonial elements, disrupting the truths of the colonial narrative, right? You have this very memoir, first-person, subjective narrative, working against larger, supposedly objective narratives of history and immigrant story, etc. And then lastly, again, I think I might have already said lastly, but this element of the talk story being sort of reused as print story and invoking, Western narratives versus Eastern narratives being sort of balled up into something that's alive but also in print, and it's this new way of using the medium itself to represent what is being created here. And so in connecting this back to our focus on immigrants and the immigration story, it's Kingston's way of, yes, chronicling through content what it is that Chinese American and their immigrant parents experienced in the middle part of the 20th century, but also by very skillfully sort of using the text and the style and the creativity that literature allows to also produce the dissonance of the immigrant experience and what this produces, not just between mothers and daughters, but in generation on generation, and how different traits of individuals, for instance, between Moon Orchid and Brave Orchid, might produce different immigrant stories. And some of let's just take it back to Pfeiffer and look at those ideas of the immigrant zest or whatever it was that she called it. Those are of course generic versions of success stories, and Kingston's version of perhaps these are family members or amalgamations of people she's heard of over the years, is to perhaps shed a little bit more light on this particular immigrant experience. I'm going to leave it at that. I think that's a pretty good summary of the way that the novel ends. If you haven't finished yet, I'm sorry if I gave you some spoilers in there, but hopefully you're close to finishing or you'll get there soon. Reminder that you've got a response due on the entirety of the novel. Take the same approach that you did with the Pfeiffer responses. Focus in on one or two things, a specific area that allows you to maybe work out and add some other elements to your main element, and try to hit on a connection to some other things that we've worked with already, and submit it by tomorrow, Friday, 8:00 p.m. If you've got any questions, of course, I'm here. Send me an email. I'll do my best to answer when I can. Thanks a lot. See you next week.